The chair scraped once against the flagstones, a short, ugly sound, and then it was gone, carried out by a footman who would not meet her eyes. 7 days. That was what remained of her commission, and now, on the first morning of it, she was to stand for the reading of accounts like a servant awaiting instruction. Rain had been falling on Ashcombe Hall since before dawn, a thin, persistent November rain that found every gap in stone and window frame, so that the estate room smelled of wet wool and older damp beneath it. Decades of damp, soaked into the timbers long before she was born. She had counted the ledgers stacked at the far end of the table when she'd first entered, 41, their spines cracked, their leather gone the color of weak tea. Her father would have run his thumb along those spines the way another man might touch a rosary. She had inherited his hands, if nothing else of his trade had survived him. "She is not required to sit," the chief trustee said, not to her, but to the room, as though she were a matter of drafting, rather than a person 3 feet from his elbow. He was lean, silver at the temples, his voice pitched at the register men use when they wished to be quoted later as reasonable. "This is a reading of accounts, not a parlor. Miss Hartley may observe from the corridor, if she wishes to observe at all." The other 2 trustees said nothing, which was its own kind of agreement. She did not sit down because there was, now, nowhere to sit. She stood instead with her satchel against her hip, her father's tools inside it, borrowed back from a pawnbroker for this single week, the all still faintly smelling of his workshop, and she said nothing, because 7 days was not enough time to spend any of it on men who had already decided what she was. It was in that silence that the door opened. He did not announce himself. The Duke of Renfrew rarely announced anything. The household had learned this in the 11 weeks since his cousin's death, when he had arrived to oversee an estate he had not asked for, and clearly did not relish inheriting the argument of. He was tall in the way that made low doorways a personal insult, dressed in traveling black, still dark with rain at the shoulders. And he took in the room, the ledgers, the trustees, the woman standing where a chair should have been, in perhaps 2 seconds. He said nothing to the chief trustee. He turned instead to the elderly butler waiting near the sideboard, a man who had served this house 41 years and had, in that time, learned to read a room faster than any clock could measure it. "Bring my mother's chair," the Duke said. "The one from the east parlor. Place it at the head of the table." The butler did not ask which chair he meant. He had served this house 41 years, and in that time he had learned which instructions were requests and which were verdicts. This was the latter. He crossed the hall with the unhurried gait of a man who had once, decades ago, learned that haste in front of gentry was its own kind of confession, and returned some minutes later with 2 footmen and a chair that did not belong in this room, nor in this century of the house's taste. Carved oak, dark with age, its seat upholstered in blue velvet gone the color of a winter sky, worn pale and thin at both armrests where 2 hands, one now 30 years dead, had rested through countless afternoons of correspondence and grief. The chief trustee opened his mouth. Whatever objection he had prepared did not survive contact with the Duke's face, which offered nothing, no anger, no triumph, only the flat attention of a man watching to see if anyone present would be foolish enough to speak. No one was. The chair was set at the head of the table, not beside it, not near it, as a concession might be near a thing it did not wish to touch. At the head, where the Earl himself would have sat, had he still been living to preside over the ruin of his own accounts. "Sit," the Duke said. It was the only word he had spoken to her directly, and he did not look at her when he said it, as though the instruction were a formality rather than a kindness, as though kindness were a thing he had trained himself out of offering, where it could be seen. She sat. The velvet held the cold of the room for only a moment before her own warmth answered it, and she was aware, with the particular clarity of someone who has spent 7 years learning to notice what furniture is worth before she ever learns what a person is worth, that the chair had been mended twice at the back leg, the joinery careful, unhurried, done by someone who loved the object rather than merely needed it whole. She thought of her father's hands doing the same to a cracked spine. She did not let the thought reach her face. The trustees resumed their business as though nothing had occurred, which was itself a kind of confession. Ledgers were opened. Figures were read aloud in the dry recitative particular to men discussing money that was not yet theirs, but which they had already begun, in their private arithmetic, to spend. She did not speak. She had 6 days remaining. The clock in the hall had already claimed one for her, in humiliation if nothing else, and she understood, watching the chief trustee's pen move too quickly over a column he did not read carefully, that whatever she was meant to find in that library, she would need every hour of the 6 that were left, and perhaps more courage than a borrowed chair, however finely mended, could lend her. The meeting concluded without ceremony, the trustees rising in the manner of men who had accomplished something, though the ledgers had told them nothing they had not already decided to believe. She was not asked to remain. She was not asked to leave. She gathered her satchel, the borrowed calipers, the roll of blotting cloth, the small brass rule her father had used to true a spine, before he could no longer hold one steady, and found the library on her own, guided by a footman who did not speak to her beyond naming the corridors. The room, when she reached it, took the breath from her, in a way the chair had not. Shelves rose 2 stories, broken by a gallery reached by a stair with a rotted third tread. Dust lay on the lower ranges thick enough to hold the print of a dropped glove. Someone, a housemaid, she would learn, sent ahead by the housekeeper with no more instruction than, "Make it fit to work in," had lit a small fire in the grate, more gesture than warmth, and left a single tallow candle burning low on the reading table, though it was not yet 4 o'clock. 6 days. She set down the satchel and did not sit. She counted spines instead, moving along the lower shelf with 2 fingers trailing the leather the way her father had taught her to read a book's age before its title, the give of the boards, the smell of the glue, whether the thread had been waxed or left raw. Some volumes here had not been opened in decades. One had not been opened, she judged from the stiffness of its hinge, since before the old Earl's father died. It was slow work, the kind that could not be hurried without being ruined, and she felt the 7 days, 6 now, pressing against her ribs like a hand laid flat, and not yet closing. She heard the door before she saw who had opened it. The young housemaid stood in the frame with an armful of dust cloths and an expression caught between duty and curiosity, as though she had been sent to assist and had not expected to find the room already occupied by someone who looked, in the candlelight, less like a lady come to catalogue a dead man's books than like someone come to keep vigil over him. "They said you'd want help," the girl said, though nobody said with what. "With everything," she answered, and did not smile, because there was no time yet to spend on kindness that did not also move a book from one shelf to a truer one. The girl set down the cloths. Somewhere above them, in the gallery, something shifted in the dark, a settling of old wood, or a mouse, or nothing at all, and she looked up toward it, the way a person looks toward a sound they will not yet admit troubles them, filing it away among the 100 small unfinished things this house had never once, in its long declining life, thought worth tending. The housemaid's name, she learned within the hour, was scarcely used in the house at all. She was called Girl by the cook and You there by the footman, and answered to both without complaint, the way people do who have long since stopped expecting to be addressed as anything particular. She proved, however, quick with her hands and quicker with her eyes, and by the 2nd hour of that first night, she had learned to tell a book's binding period by the stitching alone, a small competence she wore with visible pride, as though someone had finally handed her a coin worth keeping. 6 days remained. She said the number aloud once, testing its weight, and the girl looked at her oddly, not understanding yet that this was a woman, counting down toward a cliff's edge, and trying to make the counting sound like arithmetic instead of dread. They worked through the gallery shelves by lamplight, sorting damaged spines from whole ones, and it was slow, unglamorous work, the kind no one in the house above would ever think to admire, though it was the only work that would matter in the end. Dust rose in the candle's throw, like something disturbed from a long sleep. Twice the girl sneezed and apologized, as though sneezing were itself a breach of household rank. And twice she was told there was nothing here to apologize for, that the dead did not mind being disturbed, only the living seemed to. Near midnight, the girl found a stack of household ledgers wedged behind a false panel of shelving, their spines cracked, their leather gone the color of old moss. "These weren't in the list they gave you," she said, turning one over in her hands. "No," came the answer. "They weren't." And there was a stillness in the way she took it. Not eagerness, not yet. Only the wary attention of someone who has learned that anything hidden in a rich man's house was hidden for a reason, and that reasons in houses like this one were rarely generous. She set the ledgers aside for morning, when the light would be honest, and her eyes less tired than they were now, and told herself this was prudence and not cowardice. Though some part of her already suspected what waited between those pages, the way a person standing at the top of a stair suspects, before falling, the shape the fall will take. 5 days then, when the sun rose. She did not sleep long enough to dream, only long enough to wake believing she had. Morning came gray and thin, the kind of light that made no promises, and kept none. She rose before the house did, splashed water from the ewer that had gone cold in the night, and carried the ledgers to the long table beneath the library's east window, where the sun, when it troubled itself to appear, fell earliest and least kindly on old ink. 5 days. She counted them again, not aloud, only in the private arithmetic she had been keeping since the trustees named her terms, a habit now, like counting stitches, like counting coin. 5 days to finish what 11 weeks of neglect had left in ruin, and already the morning was half spent on ledgers that were not, strictly speaking, hers to open. The housemaid arrived with tea gone lukewarm by the stair, and found her already at work, sleeves pinned back, a smear of dust along one wrist where she had wiped it without noticing. "You didn't ring for the fire," the girl said, setting the tray down with the particular reproach of the young toward the self-neglecting old, though she was not old, only tired in a way that aged the shoulders before the face. "I forgot there was one to ring for," came the answer, and the girl laughed despite herself, a short, surprised sound, before catching it back, as though laughter were a thing that might be noticed and reported. The ledgers themselves gave up little at first. Rents, grain accounts, a long, dull column recording the replacement of stable roofing in a year she did not trouble to remember. But beneath the third volume, bound in calfskin gone the color of standing water, its spine cracked at the joint like a knuckle bent too often the wrong way. Her fingers caught on something that was not paper of the same year, not the same hand, not, she understood before she understood why, the same intention. She did not pull it free, not yet. She sat with her palm flat against the cover, the way one might rest a hand on a sleeping animal whose temper was unknown, and she thought of her father, who had taught her that a book's spine tells you before its pages do whether it has been opened in anger or in secrecy, and this one had been opened in secrecy, recently, carelessly, by someone who did not love the object enough to be gentle with it. The butler passed the doorway twice that hour, the second time slower than the first, though he said nothing, only noted the ledger's position on the table and the stillness of the hands above it, filing it away with the particular patience of a man who had watched this house for 41 years and had learned that its secrets announced themselves quietly, if at all, and only to those willing to sit still long enough to hear them. She did not sit still. She reached finally and turned the page. 5 days remained. She had begun marking them in the corner of her own notebook, not from anxiety, she told herself, but from the ordinary discipline of any cataloger who must apportion hours against shelves, though the truth was plainer than that, and she knew it, and did not write it down. The page she turned was not a page at all, but a fold, a single sheet of paper trimmed close and slipped between the ledger's leaves, as one might hide a pressed flower, except this had been pressed with intention rather than sentiment. The hand was careful, too careful. It had the studied evenness of a man copying rather than writing, each letter arriving at the same angle as its neighbor, the ink slightly darker, where the pen had paused to reconsider a stroke it did not trust itself to make freely. She had bound enough of her father's commissioned letters to know that a practiced hand grows careless in its confidence, and confidence was precisely what this hand lacked. She read it twice before she understood what it claimed to be. A codicil. Dated the 14th of September, a full 6 weeks after the old earl had been laid in the ground at Ashcombe churchyard, though the document did not say so, It wore the Earl's dates like a borrowed coat, ill-fitted at the shoulders. Timber rights, mineral rights beneath the Eastern Parish. Transferred, the paper said, in gratitude for services rendered, to a name she recognized from the reading of accounts, the same lean face that had ordered her chair carried from the room. She did not move for the length of time it takes a candle to gutter half an inch. Outside, rain had begun again, the kind that did not announce itself with wind, but simply arrived, patient and total, running the window glass into long gray ribbons. She heard it before she saw it, the way one hears a clock in another room and only later notices the hour has changed. The housemaid came in with fresh coal and found her still seated, the ledger open, her hand no longer resting on the cover, but pressed flat against the folded page itself, as though she might, by will alone, keep it from being any older or any newer than it already was. "Miss?" the girl said. She did not answer at once. When she did, her voice was even, the way her father's had always been, even when a customer brought him a forged signature on a bill of sale, and he had to decide, in the space of a breath, whether honesty was worth the loss of the commission. "Fetch nothing," she said. "Only remember what hour it is, and what day." The girl looked at her a moment longer than was proper, then went, and did not ask why, though she would remember the question for a long time afterward, turning it over the way one turns over a coin whose value one has not yet learned to name. 4 days remained, and she had begun, without quite meaning to, marking them the way a prisoner marks a wall, not with despair, but with the particular discipline of someone who has decided that despair is a luxury she cannot yet afford. She rose before the frost had left the inside of the window pane, dressed by candlelight, and was at the library table before the household bell had finished its second toll. The green ledger sat where she had left it, closed now, its cracked spine catching the gray morning, like a scar catching a scalpel's old light. She did not open it at once. She had learned, over 11 weeks of her father's trade and 26 years of watching him work, that the second look at a forged thing was more dangerous than the first. The eye grows confident, and confidence is where forgers make their living. Instead, she went to the estate room, where the leases were kept in a cabinet whose lock had rusted shut some time before the old Earl's death, and had never been repaired, only forced. The butler found her there an hour later, her sleeves pushed back, her fingers black with the dust of paper that had not been touched since 1826. He said nothing of the impropriety of a woman rifling through the estate's private instruments. He only set down a cup of tea, already going cold in the draught from the hall, and stood a moment longer than his duties required. "You are looking for something in particular," he said. "I am looking for a hand," she answered, not glancing up. A man's hand does not change with the seasons, whatever else about him might. He did not ask whose hand. She suspected he already knew, or had known for longer than either of them had said aloud, and that his silence was not ignorance, but a kind of loyalty, still deciding which direction to bend. By midday she had found the lease, a document dated the 14th of March 1826, granting timber passage through the eastern coppice, signed at the bottom in a hand she recognized instantly, though she made herself study it twice more before she trusted the recognition. The loops of the capital letters leaned left in a manner most hands did not, a small imperfection a man forgets to disguise, even when he is disguising everything else. She set it beside the codicil, not touching them together, only near enough that the eye could travel from one to the other without losing its place. The rain had stopped by then. She noticed the silence of it more than she had noticed the sound. 3 days left, she thought, and did not write the number down anywhere, though she felt it settle into her chest like a stone dropped into still water, the rings of it moving outward long after the stone itself had gone still. She did not sleep well that night, though she lay still enough to let the young housemaid believe she had. The girl had brought a second candle without being asked, setting it on the writing table with the particular carefulness of someone who understood, without being told, that something had shifted in the room's importance. Neither of them spoke of the 2 documents lying beneath a square of blotting paper, weighted at the corners with a pair of iron drawer pulls salvaged from a broken cabinet. It was not hiding, precisely. It was patience wearing the shape of caution. By morning, she had copied both signatures 3 times onto a fresh sheet, side by side, in her own hand, so that even if the originals were somehow removed from her keeping, the shape of the fraud would survive in ink she had made herself. She did not trust the house to protect what it had already tried once to erase. The chief trustee had not spoken to her directly in 4 days, which she had first taken for indifference, and now understood as the particular silence of a man recalculating his footing. The Duke found her in the library shortly after 9, standing at the tall window with the copied sheet still in her hand, though she had not meant to be caught holding it there, exposed to whatever light the gray morning offered. "You've found something," he said. "Not a question." "I've found 2 hands pretending to be one," she said, and turned the sheet so he could see it, without her needing to explain further, trusting the loops of the letters to do the work that speech might only weaken. He studied it longer than she expected, a man of his rank to study anything held out to him by a woman without title. His face did not change in any way she could name afterward, though something in the set of his shoulders seemed to settle, as a door settles into its frame after being pushed shut against a draft. 3 days, he said, and she understood he had counted them as carefully as she had, though neither of them had spoken the number aloud until now. 3 days, she agreed, to prove what I already know, in a manner that men who do not wish to see it cannot refuse to see. He did not answer that directly. Instead, he asked whether the lease document could be moved without damage, and she said it could, if handled with the same care one gave a burn not yet healed. He nodded once, as though filing the answer away for a use he had not yet decided upon, and left her standing again at the window, the gray light unchanged, the stone in her chest not lighter but, for the first time, not entirely alone in the room. The housemaid found her an hour later, still at the window, though the light had shifted enough to tell that noon had come and gone, without either of them marking it with food or fire. A tray had been left outside the library door, cold mutton, bread gone stiff at the edges, tea steeped past bitterness into something closer to punishment. The girl set it down without comment and stood a moment longer than her duties required, watching the way her mistress's fingers still hovered near the lease document as though it might, unwatched, decide to alter itself back into innocence. 3 days, the girl said, not quite a question. 3 days. The word had already worn a groove in her mouth, the way a coin, worn smooth, loses its date but keeps its weight. She ate standing, because sitting felt like a concession to time she could not spare, and between bites she began again the work of separating the codicil's ink from its paper in her mind, stroke by stroke, comparing it against the lease's confident, unhesitating hand, until the forger's hesitations declared themselves like tremors in a voice pitched too carefully steady. By the 4th hour of the afternoon, the light had thinned to the color of dishwater, and the cold had crept up through the flagstones into her stockinged feet, for she had long since abandoned the false economy of pinching shoes, meant for standing, rather than for the hours of stillness her work demanded. She sent the housemaid for the estate's earlier account books, 1825, 1826, not for their figures but for the paper itself, its grain, and its age, wanting to know whether the sheet bearing the codicil had been cut from stock the household still possessed, or from something newer, smuggled in. It was newer, finer, a paper the old Earl, thrifty in his final years, would not have purchased for himself. She wrote this down in a hand she kept deliberately plain, resisting the temptation toward flourish that might read, to a suspicious eye, as embellishment rather than evidence. The butler passed the library door twice that evening and did not enter either time, though on the second passing he paused long enough that she heard the particular creak of floorboard beneath a foot, uncertain whether to advance or retreat. When she looked up, he was already gone, leaving only the impression that something in the house had been listening at the seams. Night came early, as it did in that season, and with it the particular silence of a house where too many people were awake and pretending otherwise. She banked the fire herself, having learned by the second day that no one would think to send a servant so late on her behalf, and sat a while longer with the 2 documents laid side by side upon the desk, one true, one lying so convincingly that only patience, hers, and now, it seemed, his, stood between the lie and its triumph. 4 days remained, and she counted them now the way her father had once counted glue-drying hours, not with dread, but with the particular arithmetic of a craftsman who knows exactly how much can be done in the time allotted and how much cannot. She had learned, in childhood, that a spine rushed was a spine ruined. The lesson applied, she found, to more than books. The lease document from 1826 she had not yet located, though she knew it must exist somewhere in the estate's records, filed perhaps under timber rights or tenancy renewals, categories she had not yet been given leave to search. That leave would require asking, and asking would require revealing more than she yet wished the household to know she suspected. She weighed this against the shrinking days, and decided, as the fire settled to embers, that 4 remained enough, barely, to be patient a little longer. The housemaid found her still at the desk past midnight, having come, she said, to see whether the fire wanted banking again, though her eyes went first to the 2 documents before they went to the flames. She was 17, quick in her movements, quicker in her noticing, and she had taken to lingering in the library on errands that did not strictly require lingering. "You've not slept proper in 3 nights," the girl said, not quite a question. "I have slept adequately." "That's not the same thing, miss. Begging your pardon." She knelt at the grate, added a log with more care than the task required, and did not look up when she spoke again. His Grace asked cook this evening whether the library fire wanted more coal sent up, asked it himself, not through Mr. Price. Eleanor said nothing to this, though her pen paused above the page a moment longer than the sentence required. "Cook thought it peculiar," the girl went on, "him troubling himself over a fire in a room he don't often visit. Perhaps he found the evening cold." "Perhaps," the girl agreed, in the tone of one perfectly willing to let a lie stand unchallenged between them, out of courtesy rather than belief. She rose, brushed the ash from her apron, and gathered the empty teacup that had gone cold hours before, without Eleanor noticing its going. At the door she paused, as the butler had paused, though with less uncertainty in her step. "You'll find it, miss, whatever it is you're looking for in there." She nodded toward the ledger, not unkindly. "Been watching you long enough to know you don't stop at things you can't finish." The door closed softly behind her. Eleanor sat a moment in the returning quiet, the fire newly fed and beginning to catch, and thought of coal, ordered by a man, who did not visit the room it warmed. Then she drew the lease inventory toward her, for she would need, tomorrow, some pretext for asking Mr. Price where old tenancy papers were kept. And 4 days, she reminded herself, were still 4 days, not 3, not yet. Morning arrived gray and reluctant, the sort of light that seemed to apologize for itself as it crept along the library floor. 4 days, she had said the night before, and now 3 of those hours had already gone into dressing, into the walk down the cold east corridor, into the small negotiations a woman must make with a house that was not hers before she could ask anything of anyone in it. She found the steward's man, Mr. Price, in the estate office counting quills as though they were coin, and put her question plainly, the way her father had taught her to ask for materials from tradesmen who might otherwise sense weakness and charge for it. Old tenancy papers, leases predating the present decade. Where might they be kept, and might she see them? He looked at her the way men of small authority often looked at requests that fell outside their ledgers of habit, suspicious first, then merely tired. "Muniment room," he said, "locked. Steward before me had the key. I've not had cause to open it in 6 years. Then I should be glad of the cause now." He did not move at once. She waited, having learned in 11 days at Ashcombe that waiting, done correctly, was its own form of pressure, quieter than argument, harder to refuse. He found the key eventually, in a drawer that smelled of tallow and mouse, and led her down a passage she had not yet walked, past a window through which she glimpsed the stable yard, and, briefly, a figure in a dark coat crossing it without hurry, the Duke's shoulders set in the particular stillness of a man thinking of something he had not decided whether to say aloud. The muniment room, when opened, released a breath of dust and old paper so thick it seemed to have substance, Boxes lined the walls, unlabeled, their corners furred with gray. She lit the single candle Price provided, and began, methodically, the way she had begun the library 11 days before, corner by corner, box by box. No assumption yet as to what she sought beyond a date, an 1826 hand, a signature that might, if fortune allowed it, resemble one already pressed into her memory from a cracked green ledger. It was slow work, and the candle burned faster than she liked. Price did not stay to watch her. He had quills to count, he said, and left her to the dust and the silence and the small scratching sounds a room makes when no one has disturbed it in years. 3 hours passed before her fingers, moving without particular hope, closed on a box near the bottom of the third shelf, its lid softer with damp than the others, its contents smelling faintly of leather oil rather than mildew. The smell, she thought, of papers someone had once cared enough to dress. She lifted the lid. 4 days remained. Inside the box lay perhaps a dozen documents, tied with a ribbon gone the color of weak tea, and on top of them a lease agreement dated the 14th of March, 1826, its wax seal still intact at one corner, though the rest had crumbled to red dust. She lifted it out with the particular care she gave to spines already cracked, aware that a single careless fold could undo 11 days' labor in a moment. The candle guttered as she tilted the page toward it, and for a moment she thought the flame itself might fail her before her eyes could finish their work. It did not. The signature at the base of the lease was the Earl's. She knew it now, the way she knew her father's hand, without needing to think the knowing. But beneath the witnessing line, in a smaller script, was another name, and beside it a flourish she had seen only once before, pressed between the pages of a green ledger, dated 5 years later, dressed up in borrowed letters to look like a dead man's hand. She did not move for the length of time it took the candle to burn a quarter-inch lower. Then she set the lease flat upon the box lid and took from her satchel the folded scrap on which she had, 3 nights running, copied the codicil's signature stroke by stroke, until her wrist ached, not from any wish to forge, but from the opposite discipline, the discipline of a bookbinder's daughter, who had been taught that to understand a hand truly one must first learn to write it oneself. She laid the two beside each other. The candle threw both into the same trembling light. The letters did not merely resemble one another. They were the same hand, tired into a second attempt, the same lean upward stroke on the capital, the same hesitation before the final descender, a hesitation she now understood, not as forgery's tremor, but as the tremor of a man copying his own signature 5 years on, older, less certain of the shape his younger self had made. She sat back on her heels in the dust and said nothing aloud, though something in her chest had gone very still, the way water goes still just before it is disturbed. It was not proof enough to lay before the trustees, not yet. A lease and a codicil, side by side in a girl's candlelight, would be called coincidence by men who had every reason to insist upon coincidence. She would need the ledger itself brought here, the 2 documents set together under witnesses who could not later claim to have looked away. She would need, she thought, folding the lease back into its box with hands that had gone unaccountably cold, 4 days in which nothing was misplaced, nothing was lost, and no one who wished her silent learned what she now knew before she was ready to speak it. 4 days. She counted them the way her father had once counted glue-drying hours, not with impatience, but with the particular attention of a woman who understood that time, mismanaged, forgives nothing. The estate office clock in the passage struck 11 as she climbed the stairs, and she found herself translating the sound into arithmetic, 96 hours, perhaps fewer if the trustees moved their reckoning forward, as men in a hurry to bury something often did. She did not sleep so much as she rationed unconsciousness, 4 hours taken in a chair rather than a bed, because a bed suggested a night, and a night suggested she had time to spend carelessly. The housemaid found her at dawn, still in yesterday's collar, the lease document returned to its box, the ledger wrapped in a linen cloth and set beneath a false bottom of octavo pamphlets no one but a bookbinder's daughter would think to lift. "You've not slept." "I've slept enough." She did not look up from the shelf she was pretending to sort. Enough is a different measure than sufficient. The girl set down the tea tray without comment, though her eyes went, as they had begun to do, toward the window that overlooked the stable yard, where a tall figure in a greatcoat was crossing toward the kennels in the thin gray light, unaware, or perhaps entirely aware, that he was watched. By midday, the chief trustee had come again, ostensibly to inquire after her progress, in truth, to stand too long in the doorway counting the crates she had sealed. 4 days remain, he said, as though reminding a servant of a debt. I am aware of the date, sir. One wonders whether awareness will translate to completion. One generally does wonder when one hopes for failure. He did not answer that. His mouth moved as if to, and did not, and he left the way men leave rooms in which they have lost an exchange they did not realize they had entered, quickly, and blaming the weather for it. She waited until his boots had faded on the stair before she allowed her hands to shake, briefly, the way they had not permitted themselves to in his presence. That evening the Duke came to the library without ceremony, as had become his habit, and stood some while at the far table before he spoke. "You've found something." It was not a question, and she did not treat it as one. "I've found the shape of something, not yet the whole of it." "How long?" 4 days, Your Grace. Perhaps less, if he moves the reckoning forward, which men in his position generally do, once they suspect a woman has begun counting alongside them. He looked at her a long moment, and something in his face, not warmth, not yet, but the absence of its opposite, settled like a hand laid flat upon a table. "Then we shall not give him cause to suspect it," he said, and turned to bar the library door himself, for the first time, from the inside. The bar fell into its bracket with a sound like a small verdict. She did not remark on it. There are gestures that ask to be left unspoken, and this was one, a man closing a room not to trap her within it, but to keep the world without. 4 days. She had begun, without meaning to, marking them the way her father had once marked the curing of glue, not by the clock, but by what could and could not yet be undone. She spread the 1826 lease beside the green calfskin ledger and set a single candle between them, close enough that the light fell flat and merciless across both hands' worth of ink. The lease signature moved with a certain haste peculiar to men who sign many documents in a single sitting, the downstroke of the capital heavy, then thinning, as though the pen had been lifted a fraction before the letter's true end. The codicil's signature was slower, too slow. A forger's care shows itself precisely where a true hand shows none, in the places where haste ought to have lived and did not. He copied the shape, she said, half to the Duke, half to the candle, but not the speed. A man cannot forge the speed of another man's hand. He can only forge its outline and hope no one troubles to time it. The Duke said nothing for a while. He had drawn a chair near, not the Duchess's chair, which remained at the library's head like a standing appointment, but a plainer one, the sort a man takes when he intends to stay without announcing that he intends to stay. "Show me," he said. She did, tracing the downstroke of each with the blunt end of her pen, not touching the paper itself. He watched her hands more than the letters, though he would not have said so, and she did not ask him to. The housemaid brought tea near midnight that neither of them drank, and lingered a moment at the door before withdrawing, long enough to see the Duke lean forward at some observation of the ledger's watermark, long enough to see that he did not lean back again for some time after. She said nothing of it to anyone, but she carried the sight downstairs the way one carries an ember cupped in both palms, careful not to let the draught in the servants' passage take it from her. By the second hour past midnight, the shape of the something had thickened into the beginning of proof, though not yet its whole, a signature beneath a signature, a hand beneath a hand, waiting to be drawn fully into light. 3 days remained, perhaps fewer. The candle guttered low. Neither of them moved to relight it at once. It was he who relit it, at last, striking the flint himself rather than ringing for the task to be done by other hands. A small thing, but she noted it the way she noted everything now, filing it beside the watermark and the slant of the false hand, as though small things and large ones belonged in the same ledger. The flame caught, light climbed the page again, and with it The signature beneath the signature, faint as breath on glass. 3 days. She said the number to herself, the way one says a psalm learned too young to question, not for comfort exactly, but for shape, for something to hold the hours to. He did not leave when the clock in the hall struck 2. He did not leave when it struck the half. She had stopped expecting him to, though she would not have admitted this even to the housemaid, who by now had ceased pretending she came only for the tea things, and had taken instead to mending a hem by the far window, needle moving slower than any hem required. The trustee's hand slants right when he is hurried, Eleanor said, and left when he believes himself unobserved. This, she touched the pen's blunt end to the codicil's flourish, slants left from the first stroke. A man does not forge another man's signature, and remember, in the forging, that his own hand betrays him when he is not hurried. The Duke said nothing for the length of 3 breaths. Then, "You have made a study of him." "I have made a study of hands, your grace." His is only the one that keeps appearing where it ought not. He looked at her then, in the way the butler had once described to no one but himself, not the look of a man cataloguing a servant's usefulness, but of a man recalculating the weight of a thing he had believed he already understood the measure of. She did not return the look. She had learned, over 11 weeks of borrowed chairs and shortened days, that to return such a look was to invite a conversation neither of them had time to finish. The candle burned lower. Outside, the rain that had threatened since dusk finally came, tapping the library windows in a rhythm too irregular to be called steady, too persistent to be ignored. Neither of them remarked on it. The housemaid set down her needle at last, and did not pick it up again, watching instead the small tableau at the long table, 2 heads bent near enough that the space between them had become, without either noticing, a kind of shared country. 3 days remained. Perhaps, by the striking of the next hour, fewer. By morning, the rain had thinned to a mist that clung to the park like breath on glass, and the library, when she entered it, smelled of wet stone and old paper in equal measure. She had slept perhaps 3 hours, folded into the wing-back chair nearest the hearth, and woke with the green calfskin ledger still open on her lap, its cracked spine pressed into her palm like the ghost of a handshake. The housemaid brought tea that had gone lukewarm by the time it reached the table, and neither of them remarked on that either. There was a rhythm now to what went unremarked. It had become its own language. She spent the early hours cross-referencing dates, the codicil against the lease against the estate's timber correspondence from 1826, a year she was coming to know the way one knows a difficult relation, intimately and without affection. The chief trustee's hand, when it slipped free of its disguise, did so in small places, the looping descender of a lowercase. G. A habit of crossing his. T. As high above the stem, she had found 4 instances now. She wanted 6 before she would call it certain enough to speak aloud in a room full of men who would not want to hear it. The surge came at 9:30, when the library door opened without a knock, and the chief trustee himself stood in it, his coat still beaded with the morning's damp, his expression arranged into something that wanted to pass for courtesy, and did not quite manage it. "I am told the Duke has taken a particular interest in your progress," he said. "He has taken an interest in the accounts, sir. I am merely the one holding them. You hold a great many things, for a woman with 3 days left to hold them in." His eyes moved once, briefly, to the ledger beneath her hand, and she was careful, she had learned to be careful, not to move it, not to cover it, not to give him the satisfaction of watching her protect what she had already decided he must not know she'd found. "I trust you will have something to show for the Duke's confidence when the week is out." "I trust the same, sir." He held her gaze a moment longer than courtesy required, as though testing whether she would look away first, and when she did not, he inclined his head with the smallest, coldest civility, and withdrew, his boots receding down the stone corridor at a pace that was not quite unhurried. The housemaid let out a breath she had apparently been holding since the door opened. "He suspects something." "He suspects everything," she said, drawing the ledger closer at last, now that there was no one to see her do it. "That is not the same as knowing it." She turned to a fresh page, dipped her pen, and did not look up again for a long while. 3 days. The word sat in her chest like a held note, waiting for the hour it would have to be sung. The rain had not stopped since Tuesday, and by the 3rd day it had settled into something less like weather and more like a fact of the house, a sound she no longer heard unless she stopped to listen for it, the way one stops hearing one's own heartbeat until a doctor asks. She worked by the light of 2 candles and the gray window, and the housemaid worked beside her, sorting loose papers into stacks that meant nothing to her and everything to the woman who read them. "This one," the housemaid said, holding up a single sheet, "has the same ink as the lease you showed me. The brown one, gone rust at the edges." She took it without speaking and held it to the candle. An 1826 receipt for timber cut along the eastern boundary, signed at the bottom in a hand she now knew the way one knows a face seen too many times to forget. The chief trustee's own signature, plain and unhurried, made without the fear of being studied. She set it beside the ledger, open still to the page pressed flat by 3 days of use, and looked from one to the other. The letters did not match, not entirely. But beneath the codicil's careful borrowed strokes, she could see now what she had only suspected before, the ghost of a different hand trying to remember itself, the pen slowing where it should have moved fast, hurrying where a practiced signature would have been unhurried. Forgery, she had come to understand, was not a failure of skill, it was a failure of forgetting. A man could copy another man's letters. He could not copy the years he had spent writing his own name a different way. 4 days, the housemaid said, not looking up from her sorting. 3, she corrected, and did not explain the correction, because to explain it would have meant admitting how closely she had begun to count the hours rather than the days, how the number had stopped being an abstraction and become instead something she felt in the muscles of her hand each time she picked up the pen. Below, in the corridor beyond the library door, footsteps passed twice, once quick, once slow, and neither paused. She did not look up for either. She had learned, in 11 weeks of watching men decide what she was worth, by the sound of her chair scraping a floor, that stillness was its own kind of answer, and that the ones who wished to unsettle her would learn nothing from a woman who did not flinch at footsteps. The candle guttered once and steadied. Outside, the rain thinned to a mist that clung to the window panes without falling, as though even the sky had grown too tired to commit to an ending. She copied the 2 signatures onto a fresh sheet, side by side, in her own small, precise hand, and beneath them wrote nothing at all, only a line, left blank, for the proof she did not yet have but meant, before the week was out, to find. 4 days remained. She had begun to mark them not on any calendar, but against the wax that pooled and hardened on the candlestick each night, a small gray ring for every dawn she had not slept through properly. The housemaid noticed this too, though she said nothing of it directly, only brought, unasked, a second candle before the first had guttered, and a cup of tea that had long since gone cold by the time it was remembered. "You've not eaten," the girl said once, setting down a plate of bread and a wedge of cheese with the carefulness of someone placing an offering rather than a meal. "I've eaten," she answered, though the plate from the day before still sat untouched by the window, its edges gathering dust like everything else in that room that was not paper. The girl did not press her. She only lingered a moment longer than duty required, glancing toward the shelf where the green calfskin ledger sat now closed, its spine cracked further than when it had arrived, as though the book itself had begun to feel the strain of what it held. Then she left, and the door clicked shut with a softness that seemed, in that hour, almost an act of mercy. She turned back to the desk. The 1826 lease lay beside the codicil, both signatures inked in the same brown-black hand, and yet not the same. She had known it in her fingers before she had known it in her eyes, the way a bookbinder knows a false seam by touch before the light ever confirms it. The pressure of the pen differed at the base of the capital letter. The loop of the final stroke curled inward on one page and outward on the other, a hesitation disguised as flourish. It was not enough. A resemblance was not a proof, and she had learned, watching men who wore proof, like a coat they could remove at will, that a woman's certainty counted for nothing unless it could be held up to a room and survive the holding. She needed a third hand, an undisputed one, written plainly, without disguise, that could stand between the two and show which was borrowed and which was true. Somewhere in 11 weeks of ledgers, there had to be one page the chief trustee had signed without thinking anyone would ever look twice. She began again at the beginning of the earliest volume, the one bound in the cracked green calfskin, turning each brittle leaf with the same patience she gave to every book that had outlived the hands that made it, as though the paper itself might, if asked gently enough, remember what it had been made to forget. 2 days remained. She marked the number in her mind the way she marked collation errors, without comment, only accounting, and went on turning leaves. Rain had begun sometime in the night, and had not stopped since, a steady gray weight against the library windows that made the candles necessary even at noon. The housemaid brought tea that went cold before it was touched, then brought more, and said nothing about the first cup, only set it beside the ledger with the particular carefulness of someone who had learned not to interrupt. By the 4th hour she had found nothing. By the 6th, her eyes had begun to blur the columns into a single gray field, figures dissolving into weather. She rubbed the heel of her hand against her brow and made herself read the entry again. Coal, 40 shillings, the 18th of March, and understood that she was no longer reading at all, only looking. She set the ledger down and stood at the window instead, watching the rain darken the gravel drive, and allowed herself, for the length of one held breath, to consider the shape of failure. 2 days. A room full of men who had already decided what she was before she opened her mouth. A signature that resembled another signature, which was not the same as a signature that proved anything. Then she returned to the desk, because there was nothing else to be done with the time but spend it. It was in the 9th volume, not the accounts at all, but a slim record of tenant leases she had set aside a fortnight earlier as unrelated, its spine so cracked it had nearly come apart in her hands, that she found the entry dated the 11th of September, 1826. A renewal of terms for the northern timber parcel, signed at the foot in a hand she recognized instantly, not because it resembled the codicil, but because it did not try to. It was plain, unhurried, confident in a way that needed no flourish, the way a man writes his own name 1,000 times, without ever once considering that someone might, years later, hold it up beside a forgery and ask it to testify. She laid the 3 documents side by side on the desk, the codicil, the lease, and beneath the lease's plain script, faint but unmistakable when the candle was brought close enough, the ghost of an earlier attempt, a signature begun and abandoned, the same hesitation at the base of the capital letter that she had found in the codicil's careful imitation. He had practiced. Before he had disguised the hand, he had first written his own, and some tired evening's carelessness had let it stand. The housemaid, setting down the 3rd cup of tea, went very still. "That's his," she said. "Not a question." Eleanor did not answer at once. She was already reaching for a clean sheet of paper, already beginning, in her own steady hand, to write down exactly where each line could be found, page, volume, date, because a certainty that could not be pointed to was worth nothing at all, and 2 days was not so very long a time in which to make a case as plain as the man's own careless signature had, at last, made itself. 2 days. She wrote the words at the top of the page before anything else, as though naming the number might discipline it. 5 o'clock, the 5th day, 60-some hours remaining. And then she set to the work of proof, which she had learned from her father was never the same as the work of discovery. Discovery was the candle brought close, the held breath, the housemaid's flat certainty. Proof was slower. Proof did not trust itself. She copied the codicil's forged signature 3 times, freehand, until her own wrist ached with the memory of its false confidence. She copied the lease's true signature beside it. And beneath both, in the space where no one but a woman who had spent a childhood watching her father test glue and thread and the patience of collectors would think to look, she copied the ghost, the abandoned first attempt, half a name and then nothing, as though the trustee's hand itself had balked before his will overruled it. The housemaid brought a fourth cup of tea no one drank. "You'll want the magistrate's clerk to see it laid out just so," the girl offered, hovering. "Same as you've done it here." "I'll want more than that," Eleanor said. "I'll want it to survive being doubted." She did not say by whom. She did not need to. The chief trustee's face, composed and courteous at every accounting, rose in her mind unbidden, the way a man who has practiced looking untroubled can wear that look even while drowning. Outside, the light was already thinning toward the early dark of late November, the fourth such dusk since she had first opened the green calfskin ledger, and she found herself counting not forward but backward, the way one does near the end of any long task, not "How much is left?" but "How much has already been spent and cannot be spent again?" 4 days gone, 3 nights of sleep that amounted, together, to perhaps 1 full night's worth. A commission that had begun as an insult and had become, without her quite marking the moment of the turning, the only thing in the house that mattered to her more than her own exhaustion. She thought of the chair. Blue velvet, worn pale at the arms. She had not sat in it since the reading of accounts, though it remained, she had been told, exactly where it had been placed, at the head of the table, waiting. A knock came at the library door, later than any household knock had come before. The butler's step, unhurried as ever after 41 years of unhurried steps. But his face, when the housemaid let him in, wore something Eleanor had not yet seen on it. "His Grace asks that you come down," he said. "The trustee has requested tonight's ledgers be released early, tomorrow, not the day appointed." Eleanor set down her pen. 2 days had, without warning, become 1. The stairs down from the library had never seemed long to her before. Tonight they seemed to multiply beneath her feet, each tread a small negotiation between the body's exhaustion and the mind's sudden cold clarity. One day, not 7, not 3, not the 2 she had allotted herself in the arithmetic of the candle stub burning low on the desk behind her. One day, and the ledgers to be surrendered before she had finished tracing the lease signature back through its layers, before she had proven what she already knew in the marrow of her hands, that the hand beneath the forgery and the hand upon the 1826 lease were the same hand, practiced into a stranger's shape. The Duke stood in the hall below, not pacing, though something in his stillness suggested a man who had considered pacing and rejected it as beneath the dignity of the hour. Candlelight caught the gray at his temples in a way that made him look, for the first time since she had known him, less like a man withholding judgment and more like a man withholding fear. "He means to have the accounts before the household wakes," he said, "before witnesses gather, before you can finish what you came to finish. Then I shall not sleep tonight. You have said that on 3 nights already. I have meant it more each time." Something moved at the corner of his mouth that was not quite a smile. She had learned, over 4 days, to read the difference between his silences, and this one carried something close to apology. "I cannot delay him without cause. He has the trustee's agreement in writing. I have only my name, and my name is not yet proof of anything." "Then give me the night, Your Grace. It may be proof enough by morning." He looked at her a long moment, the look, she thought, of a man measuring a debt he had not asked to owe. The green ledger, bring it down, and the lease. She climbed back up faster than she had come down, the housemaid already gathering candles without being told, the butler already sending for stronger tea than the house usually kept for anyone below a peer. There was, in the sudden marshalling of small kindnesses, something that steadied her more than sleep would have. By the time she returned to the hall, the ledger under one arm and the lease beneath the other, the clock in the passage had already begun its slow work toward midnight. She set both documents on the table between them, side by side, green calfskin and pale vellum, one signature and its stolen twin. "One day," the Duke said again, quieter now. "One day," she answered, "is more than I had an hour ago." The candles were lit in a ring around the table, 6 of them, their light pooling yellow on the green calfskin and throwing the lease's pale vellum into a kind of ghostly white. She did not begin at once. She sat first with her hands flat on the table, as she had done on the first morning in the library, gathering herself the way her father used to gather his tools before a difficult repair, not rushing, though rushing was all the hour allowed. 6 days had taught her the shape of patience. The 7th would not be permitted to undo it. She took up the magnifying glass the old bookbinder had left her, its handle worn smooth by a hand now 3 years in the ground, and bent again over the signature at the foot of the codicil. The housemaid stood at her shoulder with a fresh candle, not speaking, watching the way the light moved when the glass moved, learning without being taught. The butler had drawn a chair near the door and did not sit in it, though his age would have excused him. He simply stood, the tea going cold on the tray beside him, as it always did in that house when something mattered more than comfort. The Duke did not sit either. He stood at the window with his back half turned, as though giving her the courtesy of privacy in a room too small to offer it, and yet she felt his attention on her the whole time, steady as the ticking of the passage clock. "The pressure changes here," she said at last, not looking up. At the base of the loop, he wrote his own name 1,000 times in his life, and never once labored over it. This hand labors. She turned the lease beside it, angled the glass, moved it slowly across both signatures, as though reading two faces for a family resemblance neither wished to admit. But the labor is familiar. I have seen it before, in the ledger's marginal notes, the ones initialed for household purchases, the same hesitation before the downstroke, the same correction, always in the same place. She looked up then, and for the first time that night, addressed him directly rather than the page. "It is his hand, beneath the imitation, Your Grace." Not skillfully hidden, only quickly. He crossed to the table and looked down at what her finger indicated, the 2 strokes side by side, and something moved behind his eyes that was not quite triumph. Closer, she thought, to the grim satisfaction of a wound finally located after days of blind pain. "Can you say it in a room full of men who will not want to hear it?" "I have said harder things in worse rooms this week," she answered, and did not smile, though the housemaid, behind her, very nearly did. Outside, the passage clock struck the half-hour, and none of them moved until the sound had entirely died away. 7 days had been given her, and by her own reckoning, 6 had already burned down to their wicks, leaving only the last, thinnest stub of the 7th, the morning still some hours off, the candle in its dish now more puddle than pillar. She had not slept. She was aware of this the way one is aware of weather, a condition to be endured rather than remedied. The lease document lay flattened under a paperweight of dark green glass, its corner still faintly damp where she had breathed on it too closely in her scrutiny. The codicil lay beside it, the 2 pages no longer strangers to each other, but old acquaintances caught out. The Duke did not leave the library that night. He took the chair opposite hers, not his mother's chair, which stood at the room's far end still smelling faintly of beeswax and old velvet, but a plainer one, a working chair, as though he had decided that tonight he too was staff. He said little. Once he asked whether she required more candles. Once he asked, with the particular delicacy of a man unused to asking anything, whether she had eaten. She had not, and did not that night either, though the housemaid brought bread and a wedge of hard cheese near midnight, and left them within reach without comment, the way one leaves food for an animal too wary to be watched while it takes it. By 4, the household accounts of 1804 through 1809 lay open at 11 separate pages, each marked with a torn strip of paper bearing a single initialed instruction in the chief trustee's hand, sums for candle wax, for saddle leather, for the mending of a garden wall, ordinary, unremarkable entries that meant nothing on their own, and everything set beside a signature meant to belong to a dead man. She had built her case the way her father built a binding, signature by signature, stitch by stitch, so that no single thread could be pulled without the whole page fraying visibly. The clock in the passage struck 4, then the half, then 5, and somewhere past that, the sky beyond the tall windows began to gray rather than blacken, and she understood, with the flat clarity of the entirely exhausted, that the 7th day had arrived whether she had finished sleeping through the 6th or not. The Duke rose when she did. He did not offer congratulation. He looked, instead, at the papers arranged before them, the true will, the false codicil, the lease that had betrayed its author, and said only, 9 o'clock then. Dress warmly. The room does not warm until noon. The room did not warm until noon, and so at 9 it was cold in the particular way of old houses in November, a cold that lived in the stone and did not care for fires. She wore her gray wool, the collar mended twice, and carried the ledger herself rather than let a footman take it, as though the weight of cracked green calfskin were something she had earned the right to bear. The trustees were already seated when she entered. The chief trustee did not rise. The Duke had the true will, and the false codicil laid side by side on the table, the lease beneath them like a foundation stone. He did not open either. He looked at her and said, "Read it." Not his solicitor, not himself. Her voice, when it came, was steady in the particular way of a person who has stopped expecting sleep to save her. She read the true will clause by clause, and then set it against the codicil, and named the candle wax, the saddle leather, the garden wall, ordinary sums that had no business anywhere near a dying man's intentions, and then she laid the 1826 lease beside them and asked the chief trustee, without raising her voice, to explain why his own hand lay beneath his forgery, like a shadow he had forgotten to erase. He did not answer. His silence answered for him. By the time the clock struck 10, the peers who had once watched a footman carry away her chair now watched him escorted from the room by men who no longer troubled to address him as trustee. The Duke said nothing to her of feeling that day. He thanked her, formally, in the manner one thanks an archivist for a service rendered, and the butler, 41 years in that house, allowed himself the smallest permitted softness at the corner of his mouth. That evening, a footman delivered to her lodging a writing desk of dark wood, worn pale at one corner, where a hand had rested for decades. The note beneath its lid was brief. "For work that outlasts the men who tried to erase it." She did not leave Ashcombe. She stayed as its appointed archivist, not its charity, and the library filled slowly with shelves that bore her father's stitching in every spine she rebound herself. 18 months on, the room had learned to hold heat by noon. She sat at the desk that had been the Duchess's, sunlight catching dust that no longer seemed like neglect, but like time settling. He came in as he often did now, without ceremony, and stood a moment reading the spines she had restored. "Does the desk still suit you?" he asked. It was not a question about furniture, and she understood that, and answered it as though it were. "It does." Neither said more. The housemaid, watching from the doorway as she so often did, thought that some things were better left unspoken, that a chair once given, and a desk given after it, had already said what needed saying, and would go on saying it, quietly, for as long as the shelves stood.